Happy Monday. How's it going, everybody?
It's going well.
Got a special guest today. What's up, Fabiana? How you doing?
Hi Joe, how are you?
Doing well. Doing well. Yeah, it's been a while since we chatted. So
Totally true. New year, now not so warm as it was in the last time we spoke, so definitely.
True enough.
it
Yeah.
happens. Yeah, what you been up to lately?
A lot of work, but also, taking some time off. So it's nice. I get recharge energies,
Hmm.
and I'll definitely focused again here on YData and growing the company for sure.
That's cool. Breaks are nice. I think Matt and I need to do that more often. We always tell ourselves that, but
We tell our employees that, and then we don't actually take breaks
yeah,
ourselves.
but
And
our
it's like,
employees
what?
tell us
Yeah.
that too. Like, you guys need to take a break, and we're like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
The
It's
book,
hard to unplug, so
it is. And the book is almost done, which is a mixed blessing, right? Like it's a really hard push at the end, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We just have to cross the finish line, and then we can relax a bit. So,
Hmm. Yeah, I got a taste
yeah.
of that yesterday though, taking a break because my power was out all day. We had a nasty storm and it like knocked out a lot of power all around the city. So it was kind of nice because I just was like, well, I guess I'll just go do something else that doesn't involve a computer because we have no internet. So
yeah.
it was nice. Yeah, went around and just yeah, drove around and sampled foods at various places. It was very cathartic. So anyway, well, cool. For people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So, my name is Fabiana, and I'm the Chief Data Officer and co-founder at YData. I'm a mathematician, so my background is in
Ooh,
mathematics. I do love mathematics, but I'm also a geek for data. I guess that defines me.
interesting.
So, what type of math, if I may ask? I'm a bit curious to hear. There are a lot of people from mathematics in data science, ML engineering, all these
Yeah.
Well, Matt,
domains.
why don't you tell her
Yeah.
your background?
So I come from representation theory, actually. So I don't know if that's an,
Oh,
but pure math side, kind of related to geometry and such. Yeah.
okay. That's very interesting. To be honest, I decided to go through the applied maths, what we call,
Yeah.
at least in Portugal, the applied maths area,
Mm,
and it really specialized more on optimization, operations. It was more around that area that I decided to specialize myself, to be honest. But
mm,
I don't think very soon I started more the space of analysis, data analysis, and multivariate data analysis.
mm.
It was what how it was called. So definitely, I did ran away from the pure mathematics, if I can
Mm.
tell this way.
I did the
Well,
same thing. Matt decided he would get his PhD in theoretical math, pure math, I guess. And you and I, Fabiana, we decided we'd run the other direction. So it's kind of
yeah.
funny. It's kind of rare you have like three mathematicians on a call, but I guess it is what it is. So that's awesome.
Definitely, pretty rare to find.
Hmm.
Yeah. But common, it feels like it's common in the data space, though. I don't know. I mean, just try to gather some real statistics and see if this actually is
Mm.
true.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, you were in math, and then what got you into data and what you're doing today?
Definitely, it was during university you kind of have different fields or explore different fields. I was in my bachelor's, and I did recall starting that statistical side of data and also this multivariate analysis. That's
Mm,
when I started to understand that, well, you can take so much and learn so much out of data without asking someone else. It's pretty interesting how you can just massage the data that you have and kind of get insights. And that's what sparkled, okay, if I can do this at this level, does this make sense professionally? And surprisingly enough, it did. So another passion I had, it was computers, so it was
mm,
something that I was exposed during university. And I knew that if I was to pursue something professionally, it had to be around data, and computers. Of course, right at the beginning, and right at that time, it was not yet called data science, or at least the space was still to be more developed, let's say. A lot of people called, well, the first steps, or were more focused on the first steps, which was around BI, what they call business intelligence. So I started there. Then, of course, I was very quick to understand that we can go further down the insights we extract, and I got involved in the machine learning space, essentially.
That's really cool. A pretty similar path, actually, to myself. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm always curious how people get from whatever they're studying into data and whatnot. It's That's pretty fascinating. But I think, let's talk about something, we kind of mentioned before we started the show. You're working on something else too with communities. We kind of bridge that into synthetic data, the main topic. But I find it really curious. What's this community thing you're working on?
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, one of the things that we have identified so far, we have started YData like 2.5 years ago, more or less. Of course, we have learned a lot. And one of the things we have learned in the data space, it's communities are essential. So keep communities involved. It's the way you learn how things are, how the type of tooling that is available, if it makes sense or not. And also it's an opportunity for you to be closer to your users, because in the end you are developing a product for data scientists. So it's essential that you start, or you have your own community and you create that. Of course, this is not, or it was not the only objective around the community. One thing that last year started to become trend, and this is a topic that well, appeared very hot in the space. It was what we call the data centric AI. And it's amazing how we have been talking about data quality. We have been understanding that garbage in, garbage out, but it's also very interesting how the data became the less romanticized thing around AI. So models, hyperparameter tuning, building big architectures starting to be the center of AI. And we kind of understood that we know that our data is important, but it became something that less or more deglamorized than the rest. But thanks to people like Andrew Young that brought this to attention last year, you kind of see that data quality is definitely now a thing. And you can understand that different stages of the machine learning space or machine learning steps do involve different aspects or different concerns around data quality. And that was exactly our drive to start the community. Essentially, we understood this is a new space, this is a new topic around. How can people get informed about it? Where can people discuss about it or have a good discussion about these topics? And what does it mean to be data-centric AI? That's why we started the community, maybe, is exactly to spark those discussions and to have, the different players and the different users that are seeking to become more data-centric. They have like this space where they can just share ideas, share potential solutions, share problems as well if required.
It's really cool. Is this a synthetic data community? Is that what you're referring to, or a different one?
So it's the data centric community.
Okay.
We decided before, we were scoping very narrowly to data, synthetic data. And to be honest, to be data centric is much more than just, investing in synthetic data.
Right.
So we decided to definitely be broader and bring other topics, even if those topics exactly.
Yeah.
even if those
Everybody
topics
go
are
sign
not.
up for that. Sorry.
Yes. Even if those topics are not, were around what YData focus on, we wanted this to be that place where everyone, has its space and can take his questions and sparkle discussions, interesting discussions in the space.
It's really cool. Yeah, again, the audience, go sign up. I know you're watching this. So, community is a really interesting thing. I think Matt and I, we're part of several meetups and organizations locally and I guess globally as well. And I totally agree. Like one of the pillars of what Ternary does is it's community, and it's about building um, not just relationships with people, but I think, as you're saying, getting, I would say, better feedback from the community on what people are doing. It's so easy to run a company just sort of living in your own bubble, and not getting any input from the outside world. I also think it's an incredibly dumb way to run a company, because if you're not connected to your users at the end of the day, like what, or just the broader community, even if they're not your users, but just like keeping your pulse on the ground of
Exactly.
what's going on. It's like, because the data space is changing so quick. There's so much going on, and like, the most interesting things are typically the things that you might be blind to. So
I think the other thing to keep in mind is the communities are also about building people, and we
mhm.
Yeah,
see
Yeah,
complaints all the time about a shortage of talent. And to be honest, often the same companies that are complaining about this aren't participating in communities, so they'll spend vast sums on recruiting. It's like, go out and be a part of the community, help to develop new talent, and then it's going to be easier for you to recruit.
exactly. That's a very good point, and definitely, I do think that more and more learning, creation of new talent, does not come just from the universities
mm-mm.
kind of route. Definitely comes more and more from these spaces, communities, especially in the data space, as Joe mentioned. So it's such a new space, and evolving and very fast in its evolution, that it's pretty hard for just a university to keep up. How can these people that are trying to know more about the data space can learn about it? Definitely communities, and
For
of
sure.
course MLOps community, our data centric AI community, what the job you are doing with this podcast, and also your community. Uh, I guess those are the spaces that people do need to hear different perspectives and to learn more about. Definitely.
Yeah, for sure. It's a Harpreet Sahota. What's up, Harpreet? He says community is hard to get right. Totally agree. It's super hard. So he runs a great community too. I think
Yeah.
he's one of the leaders, I would say, in building communities. Great guy, but yeah, it's tough. But you're right
Yeah.
too. What we see is, Matt and I both teach at the university still. Matt actually used to do that full time, but
It's a different life. Yeah.
it's a different life. Yeah, yeah. But now we do community service, aka being adjuncts. So, but what I noticed though is it is really hard, especially in a space that's changing so quick, like ML ops, for example, right? Like, I
Yeah.
don't even know how you would have a university curriculum. Josh Tobin, he does this with full stack deep learning over at Berkeley, and I think he does a great job. Um, and then obviously there's people at Stanford and other schools, I think, doing a fantastic job as well. But those are schools that are really hard to get into for the most part, and
Exactly.
like and even then I would dare say by the time some of the material comes out, it's like the things have changed already, and so it's
Yeah.
just hard to keep up. Yeah, Matt and I find the same thing in the data engineering field, where it's really a question of kind of build versus buy. Like, you can go buy data engineers or ML engineers, and you know how much it's going to cost you? A lot.
Yeah. A lot.
Well, it's
Mhm.
not just that, but often, I mean, to be quite frank, often your experienced data engineers may not have exactly the skills you need. That's a problem too, because the domain is changing so fast. You can have a lot of experience, and yet you may not exactly align with what YData or another company needs in their particular stack, and that's also an issue. So yeah, train people anywhere you can, bring new people into the community, and like build up talent.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Definitely. And I got very surprised when I knew that I discovered that data engineers, the shortage of
Yeah.
data engineers is even bigger than data scientists. So which
Yeah.
is very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's one of the goals with Matt and I, working on our book,
Yeah.
which will hopefully be done next month.
Yes.
But what we realized too is that the body of knowledge to teach data engineering, we find it was very sporadic. Like a lot of the
Hmm.
tutorials out there was like, learn data engineering by learning Spark or something, and we're like, that's really not the same thing at all, actually. Like you can learn to use Spark, but
Hmm.
it's not the same thing as like learning I would say the fundamentals of data engineering. But then we kind of unpack that and it's like, well, what are those exactly, right? And so, but the same thing in ML ops is going on right now in ML engineering. It's an incredibly tough field to unpack. Like if you were to unpack the fundamentals that aren't going to change over the next few years, like what would those be? It's not an easy question to answer. So,
Not easy, and
mm-mm,
definitely I can see that problem nowadays in the majority of the space of machine learning and data engineering, as you are mentioning. So it's very tool driven and not
mm,
like, the basis and set in stone of best practices, or what does it mean to develop a machine learning solution. The the bases are not yet settled, and I'm
mm,
maybe it's because we are still in need of consolidation in
mm.
both spaces. Both, I don't know, and this is a maybe a question I would ask you guys, if you do feel that data engineering already reached that stage of consolidation, where things are more clear now. Maybe I do feel that the machine learning space is still, could enjoy still a bit more consolidation in order to,
Eh,
set
yeah.
those bases.
I would say like the current phase of data engineering that involves maybe the modern data stack, quote unquote, that's I think a bit more settled. Although if you look at all the tools in that
Uh,
space, there's still like a billion tools per vertical.
A billion new ones
So
every year.
yeah, new ones every day. Shit. So that's I think consolidate. I would say that consolidation of best practices on the modern data stack. What I was writing about over the weekend is I feel like the modern data stack isn't that modern, and it's actually we're
hmm,
actually set for a new inflection point with how stacks are going to be created in the future and used. I coined the term the live data stack, which this might be the first time people
hmm,
hear that, but what's happening is it's going to be a tighter coupling to the application layer along with streaming, real time and low latency databases. And I think this fundamentally changes the architecture of the modern data stack, where that's a very data warehouse centric architecture. But as I think more and more and zoom out and kind of like, well, you can't say that's like the finality of where data engineering or data in general is going to be, right? Like
true.
that doesn't make any sense. But then I was talking with Dimitrios, from the ML Ops community. We're talking a couple
Yeah.
months ago about this idea of, well, it was actually I was in the we were in the Tecton office doing a podcast for the ML Ops community. I was talking with Mike De Blaso, and we're like, well, what's the equivalent of the modern data stack for ML Ops right now? And I was like, I don't know that exists. And Demetrios were
Yeah.
talking more about this, and we're like, I don't. You could make an argument it may not ever exist. I don't know. Because
True.
with the modern data stack, it's like that's a very analytics focused outcome, right? You're making
Yeah.
reports or analysis. Whereas with machine learning, there's a variety of ways you could do it, right? There's images, audio, structured data, whatever. I mean, so what
Exactly.
would be this one stack to rule them all in that case?
I think the other
Exactly.
problem, Joe, is something you pointed out, and that's that the modern data stack is kind of a repackaging of existing ideas. And so fundamentally, we're not necessarily doing a lot of new things, maybe just doing old things better. And where ML is so new, it's very, very
Well, what
hard
the
to
modern
figure
data
out.
stack did is
Yeah.
it's the equivalent of what happened with brick and mortar
Yeah.
moving to e-commerce, right? Where
Interesting.
it made it easier for you to acquire new tools, but
Yeah.
essentially, you tell me like what has it fundamentally changed under the hood in the last 30 years in practices? Nothing really. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Totally. I can understand that point. Definitely.
yeah,
Um, yeah. But on the machine learning space, I do feel that, well, as you mentioned, the standards are kind of still developing, and like a lot of things are still changing. We are not yet set even in the, this data centric versus model or data driven. a kind of discussion that exists. Well, that's still about the basis on how to develop machine learning. So it's interesting. I guess we are about to see interesting changes in ML space still.
What do you think? What do you think some of the big changes are going to be?
Essentially, I do think that, and this is my bet, we are already observing that a lot of new tools in the space of data quality are very emerging. And again, data quality has different meanings at different stages of the process, which means what we will see is definitely a stabilization of what we call the machine learning of ML ops, or kind of engineering space of delivery a machine learning solution that will become more and more mature. Because I guess we already have, I wouldn't say we already have the recipe, but at least we already have nice paths to follow in what concerns what we call the data itself. And I think here maybe data engineering will also bring some new and some new things we can use on the data quality side as well of machine learning. I do think that will be the space that you will see more things popping, either at the stage where you are just preparing the data, either when you are trying to debug your models, or when you are trying to see whether there are big shifts in the distributions of your data when you already have a model into production. All of these spaces are, you already see a lot of development on those, but I guess we will see more and more tooling appearing around.
That's really interesting. For the audience out there, I mean, let's touch on synthetic data. I mean, this is, I think, sort of like nice segue. What is it?
So, well, in a nutshell, in being very simplistic about it, we can call synthetic data is any type of data that is not collected or derived from a real world event. So I know it's a very broad kind of definition, but I guess it sets very well the tone around the discussion. What is and what kind of synthetic data are we in need for the next few years, for example? We have been dealing, to be honest, with synthetic data for the past decades. I do believe that everyone has already, in some point in time, have used fake data or data that have generated using standard libraries that just produce a data set for you to do testing or stress testing, that tests scalability of tools and so on and so forth. But now what we are observing is that we are in need for a new kind of version of synthetic data, or in this case, a type of synthetic data that is more intelligent, let's say. What do I mean by this? So essentially data that can in some way replicate what does happen in reality. And that's the type of synthetic data I would say we are observing now, or the growth of that space, and we will observe its growth for the next years, and in terms of applications and also in terms of the use cases it can deliver.
So when you say it's not derived from collected data, is there a notion of maybe taking a collected data set and using that to generate a derived data set or generate a synthetic data set?
Yes, there is still that definition or that possibility. So whenever we are talking, of course, we can generate synthetic data out of nowhere or no data collected, and potentially there you will have less, what we call less utility, or you can do simulations, and on that side is based on a bunch of assumptions that you have about reality. You can kind of simulate that data set that would meet those expectations. This type of generations do not need any prior collected data, let's say, or at least not in a very low granularity. So you can do just some kind of a population assumption base. When I'm talking about this type of data that is useful to also build machine learning solutions, most of the times, yes, you need to have a ground truth data set or a data set from where you can derive the behaviors. What essentially results differently from using the real data is exactly the part of reality, or in the sense of tracing back to real events and to real users. That's the one of the major differences, I guess.
Do you find that I'm curious as you talk to people about synthetic data, do you find that this is a new concept for them? I have to imagine, I'm not super familiar with the literature on synthetic data. I have to imagine it's not a brand new idea. But do you find that it's still kind of a sell to tell machine learning engineers that, or data engineers, that they need to start using synthetic data to protect anonymity and still have high quality models?
You are true. It's not that new, the concept, but it's harder to accept that, well, in the minds of maybe who is not yet so familiar with what is synthetic data, it's harder to accept that it can answer the same questions, or it can achieve a closer answer to the same questions you do to the real data. When do I find that people do accept this very well? When you have no other option. So you have no access to the real data. So, or it's being blocked because of privacy or security access, or because, well, you don't have enough real data. That's when it's much easier to accept the use of something that it's synthetic, and it's not collected from the real world. Because one of the assumptions that you get in the data science school is that for you to understand events or take insights, you are taking them from real data they have collected. But it's harder to accept that events that do not come from the real data can give you real answers. I guess that's the concept that is harder to get used to, for example.
It's really when it first really clicked with me. I was talking with Josh Tobin a couple years ago. He's was formerly at OpenAI, and he was like, "Yeah, I mean, I was trying. I think it was like an autonomous robot. It's hard to recall the conversation, but it was something like training an autonomous robot to do stuff." And I was like, "Well, that's interesting. Like, how would you do that if it doesn't have a lot of data?" It's like, "Well, you just give it synthetic data." It's like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, because otherwise you have this cold start problem where you have to, go through a lot of iterations and train this, autonomous thing. But if you just create a data set,
Yeah.
seem to move it a lot faster. So I was like, yeah, it actually has a lot of applications for the real world too. Obviously there's a anonymity and the privacy benefits, but there's also the ability to, I guess, get further along in your training versus having to wait to accumulate data, which is a really big problem for companies. That cool, I have to wait. How long?
Exactly.
If you're doing credit scoring models, for example, that might be like, well, you're trying to identify defaults, for example, that might take you a couple of years to get those results back, and that's a really long feedback loop. So
Yeah, exactly. Well, when you have no option, I guess you have to go for interesting routes, and I think synthetic data can be those. Of course, if you have real data and you have a full access to the granularity you need, it's very hard to tell you no, use synthetic data instead, of course.
yeah,
But when definitely you have the need, and you have no other option, why not test and give it a go? It's easier to accept when we do understand the synthetic data, or we can relate to it. And one of the spaces, as you mentioned, is, for example, self-driving cars. It's very easy when you see a synthetic image, and you see, okay, this looks real. It's easy for you to accept that synthetic data. I guess the concept gets harder when you are seeing structured data or tabular data, and we are seeing time
Right.
series and so on and so forth, it gets very abstract, and that's when you kind of having to invest as someone that is producing synthetic data in good metrics and good answers. So the users can definitely trust synthetic data as something they can build solutions on top.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Actually, I got a question here from Mark Keeling. What's up, Mark? Good morning. Is the best practice for generating of synthetic data rule based, or what guides and tools are there for creating a usable relational data set?
This is a very interesting question, and it will depend on the use case maybe Mark is dealing with. So I'm assuming in this, it has no access to real data whatsoever, or does not exist any data collected. And if that's the case, definitely to have something rule based and driven by the business is the best way to go. But bear in mind that that data, um, well, you have to have your assumptions very well aligned with the reality. And otherwise, when you are building your rule-based data set, you can kind of build biases.
Mm.
And well, the insights you take from the database you just built can be biased towards some assumptions you did. In terms of tooling, to be completely transparent, I'm not aware of one tool that solves it all. I do know Faker can be very good for some situations
Mm.
as long as you have um, your assumptions. The only problem I would say they have is it's very hard to, with Faker, generate variables and relations between variables, for example. So you kind of generate univariately, and that's the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've noticed that with Faker too. I mean, and Mark
Yeah.
has a subsequent kind of follow up here with test driven development. Yeah, I mean, stuff like Faker's used all the time, and and mocks and all this
Mm-hmm.
other stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of asked, given that, like, what are the other selling points of synthetic data?
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't say that synthetic data in the data engineering space would go far from what you have mentioned, which is the TDD.
Mm.
Definitely, that's the core use case for synthetic data. I would talk it's more around the space of machine learning and
Yeah.
development of data science solutions, where there are more selling points. Either because you are running a cold start problem, for example, or you are having a very low volume of data and you want to augment it, or because you want to correct some behaviors that you know that exist in your data set, and you want to have them correct for synthetic data, or because you are just dealing with a privacy or a sensitive data set to which it's very hard for you to get your hands on it,
Mm.
and you can't just have synthetic data. Uh, there are more use cases. For example, one good example, it was for COVID. For example, synthetic data was used exactly to give to a wider audience access to information of COVID cases, especially for the development of the vaccine, for example, which is very interesting and a very real use case of the benefits of synthetic data. But it can also be used in combination with other what we call privacy enhancing technologies, such as federated learning,
Mm.
for example, which is it's kind of interesting to see that privacy enhancing technologies in the end are complementary. So synthetic data does also play a role, but well, you have more use cases for sure than the ones I've mentioned. But these are the ones I can recall for now.
I've long felt that simulation is a technique that's kind of fallen by the wayside
Mm.
in data science and just kind of this whole field this whole ecosystem we're in. So very classical technique, very important in physics, chemistry, maybe to a lesser extent in statistics, very important in epidemiology, actually, which has brought it to the fore lately. How significant is simulation in terms of building synthetic data sets?
We do see the simulation space starting to get more interesting in the area of synthetic data. Also, because one thing that you are now able to is you learn from the real, let's say, real world. And now you want to condition the generation of your synthetic data to generate different scenarios of what would be if you manipulated, or I wouldn't say manipulated, maybe you would control some parameters. Let's say we are dealing with the production of energy, and we kind of have wind speed, wind direction, and let's say that you are kind of trying to understand the different possibilities and different behaviors of energy production depending on how the wind will behave or behaves um, in terms of speed and direction. So that's one of the spaces where synthetic data is getting very interesting, because definitely you know already the behavior, and now you can kind of condition to those behaviors you want to condition to. It is, I would say, a next step towards what Markov chains already did deliver in the past. And with this, we do see more and more investment in making the synthetic data or the technologies that are used to produce synthetic data to expand this area where, well, we saw techniques like Markov chains being like the king and queen to deliver.
Any thoughts on that, Matt?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in this space, because I think it's funny too, because simulation has played a significant role in many machine learning advances in conjunction with deep learning, for example. At least the way I understand it, the big advances in Go, which resisted a solution for a long, long time, were initially just simulation based, and then by combining that with deep learning, that's where AlphaGo made the huge advances against humans, basically. And so. Yeah, I'm just really looking forward to seeing how this space evolves, both in terms of synthetic data and just more general use of simulation techniques in conjunction with these other advances.
It's interesting. I mean, it sort of brings up a question where, I mean, is it a trend where you might see machine learning being used to create synthetic data?
Definitely, and that's what you kind of see.
Mm-hmm.
It's using and leveraging, from the power of machine learning to build the data. And the point that Matt did on exactly how robust the model to play Go got through synthetic data. It's also very interesting if we take back to verticals and others verticals like fraud detection, anti-money laundering. If you go and check not all the cases or situations, you are not able to collect for data. Are situations that are pretty rare or pretty hard to find and collect. So synthetic data can be a tool to bring that robustness, to your models, and maybe exactly simulate some situations that are possible scenarios, although they never happen.
This will be a new feature in GPT-3 coming out.
I mean, could something like GPT-3 be a source of synthetic data? I don't know, like can generate.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, I give you.
It is.
So, I mean, it literally is what Fabiana just said. It literally is synthetic data.
Yeah.
It's usually somewhat intelligible. It sometimes comes up with some pretty hilarious results. But that's just it's a bug or a feature. I'm not sure which. Actually, Russell has a question about hybrid data. He says organic data sounds better than synthetic data in most circumstances, though in some circumstances, if the organic data is of poor quality, to facilitate early model development, could wholly synthetic or some hybrid between organic and synthetic be used, temporarily bypassing issues until they can be accurately resolved. kind of a long question, but maybe you have a shorter, long answer. So
Yes, I'm assuming organic data is what we call real data or data
I'm guessing
collected
that's what it
from.
is. Yeah.
Yes,
And if also
yes.
you want to
Okay.
clarify, that'd be great. But yeah, we're operating the assumption this is real data. So
Exactly, exactly. I would say that, uh, yeah, of course, as I mentioned, real data can be a very good option for you to develop your first models. But definitely, synthetic data in combination with real one can be um, a very good solution for you to have a stronger model development and a model that gets more stable into production. I don't. If you have access to the real data, of course you should use it. And if you can improve it through the use of synthetic data, yes, I guess that's a very interesting way to go.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So it's sort of just the notion of just using kind of just automation along with kind of human in the loop data. I guess I don't know how else you'd describe that, but that makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And also, well, that this comes to another important thing about data in general, and synthetic data also, well, applies the same. Data is evolutionary, right?
mm,
So it's always evolving, it's always changing. Same for the synthetic data you generate. So you cannot assume that synthetic data will always be good from the moment it was developed until for the last few years. Things have to evolve, and that's the same happens for both the real one and the synthetic generated. It will change and evolve. So that's also an important point to always take in consideration.
what do you say, Matt?
So here's another question. So say you're coming to a machine learning engineer, hasn't used synthetic data before. What would your first pitch be? In other words, if you were to say, here's one application of synthetic data that you should try right away that will have value for you fairly quickly, what would that be?
That's a very interesting point, and a very interesting question. Definitely, if I don't have the opportunity to know first what are the pains of that
Mm,
the process is working on, I would say the most interesting piece where synthetic data could play a role is definitely to make the access to data very easy and very straightforward. Okay, so you just kind of can enable the access to of data through many for many people through the use of synthetic data instead of the real one, and also enable, for example, the development of cloud solutions. Because nowadays there are still organizations that, for example, do not allow any data to go through cloud, and we know that any machine learning development can benefit a lot from the scalability and flexibility of cloud. So definitely this is one of the things where synthetic data, you need real data, or at least data with the same usefulness as the real one. You cannot put your real data into the cloud. How can you just train your workloads? Why not doing it with synthetic
mm.
data? That would be my first selling point.
What about trying to pitch it to security teams? There's sort of a back channel conversation going on here where uh, Mark and Russell are talking about basically, let me see, um, infosec departments that may not want you using real data at all. I mean, it seems like it seems like a pretty compelling pitch with ML engineers, for example. But at the end of the day, your security team is probably going to be controlling access to the data or access to the systems that create the data. How would you pitch um, synthetic data to these types of teams?
Definitely an interesting department, and
Mm,
definitely um, harder buyers, let's say. But one of the things that I found interesting is pseudonymization. We know that does not ensure privacy.
Mm.
Okay, and we know this based on proven points that were made in the past. For example, with the Netflix
Oh
challenge,
yeah, that one. Hmm.
even the one from Apple, where I do think they have they have decided to hide the gender column, and then out of the data, it was the users were able to inference the gender because all the other informations were storing information about that variable. So this is kind of a point where, yeah, pseudonymization, it's interesting, but not ensure you the full privacy,
Mm.
let's say, or does not ensure the privacy level you are so happy about before. Computation power has increased dramatically in a way that you can very easily kind of re-identify people based on data if you just pseudo anonymize it. Now, how can I sell this to the security teams or the teams that are more concerned with that? Different from the pseudonymization, synthetic data is generating new records and new variable, and it's generating people does not exist. These new elements do have a similar behavior to a real population, but they are a reflection of a whole population and
Mm.
not a singular individual, which means that, let's say, if I do the same pseudonymization strategy, like removing IDs or removing any sensitive information, which makes sense, by the way, even for synthetic data. If I do try to, by brute force, re-identify anyone from synthetic data, it will be way harder because in reality, they don't match anyone in real life. So that's how you can sell synthetic data as something more um, as something interesting to provide to teams with the granularity they need while making security teams also happy about it.
Hmm.
And of course, all the synthetic data that is generated should be um, coupled with what we call a kind of report on not only the utility and similarity of the synthetic data, but also how much privacy does it hold when compared to the real data, for example. So are we leaking anything from the real data on the
Mm.
synthetic? All of this is a must. Otherwise, even the teams that are using the synthetic data, it's very hard for them to trust if they don't know how similar, how private, and how good it is, this new data.
What's the role of synthetic data in combating biases? So you talked about the fact that models can often recognize, say, male, female, at least statistically, from
Yeah,
other data within those data sets. You've got racial bias, cultural bias, nationality bias, language bias, like all kinds of things that
yeah,
machine learning models tend to really pick up on. Any kind of human signal there, they'll learn from, basically.
They're just like children.
yeah.
Yes.
That's a good way to put it. Definitely, that is an interesting kind of application for synthetic data to deal with those biases. I wouldn't call synthetic data, let's say, the only and only solution for bias because that wouldn't be the case. You have implicit bias. How can you just use synthetic data to cover that up? Unless you are already aware that bias exists and you kind of simulate the data that it's missing, which is one option for synthetic data. It's very hard for you to mitigate the implicit bias. Let's say we are talking about the explicit one, and we already know situations. Let's call the easier example where we have gender, female and male, let's say, imagine, and then you have the salary, and you kind of observe that in general, females earn less than men and also are less represented within your data set. That's when you can learn the behaviors from this population, but knowing what is your aim, which is kind of achieve equal salaries for the
Mm.
gender and also equal representation, you kind of generate a synthetic data that is more balanced. Of course, you are kind of introducing your perception of what the world should be, but this is kind of one of the solutions that you can get to mitigate the perpetuation
Mm.
of this type of behaviors and well, that type of detections from machine learning models. You
Yeah.
give a synthesized data set, which is more balanced and more fair.
Actually, Guy Thompson has kind of something similar. He can see a good use case for synthetic data by injecting more risk volatility to a data set, which could lead to more conservative algorithms by, say, a financial industry or infosec. So I think what you're kind of both describing is the ability to also sort of help push certain outcomes, right?
Exactly.
Versus, I think the word that you use, perpetuate, is a wonderful word to describe the perpetuation of, say, biases or sort of a continuation of whatever trend that might not be desirable. So,
Yeah, it's very hard for you to have to wait for the loop of the data to come with the
Yeah.
reality you would expect to be the reality, let's say. So you can just, cut off the path. And some will say this is a kind of a manipulation. Some will say this is the required exactly to not perpetuate some behaviors. It's an interesting discussion.
hmm I think it's going to be also an interesting discussion as there's more of a push for automation, right?
Yeah.
And in less heuristics based. So it's like, and self-driving cars come to mind. If you want to have a certain outcome on a car, it's like, I'm not just going to wait years for it to figure it out. It's like, I'm just going to probably, train it so it'll operate better. Trying to crash into things too much, but we see the point, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, but it's an interesting dilemma in some cases, though, with because there's a lot of power increasing as the world becomes automated and more ML powered and AI powered. Like it's a great power that on the contrary, what I'm slightly concerned with is you have misinformation right now, and then what does this do? Is there sort of an analogy here where ML sort of provides not just misinformation but like um, I guess misperpetuation or something of certain outcomes that you don't want. I know we're all trying to, like, I think, make models for the common good, but what happens if you start making models for the common bad?
Yes, and that definitely can be a reality for sure.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I do feel like, and this is both the field of generation and synthetic data, but also the field of generating or building models that can benefit from, is to know better the data, to know better the relations, to understand the causality between variables, to really well profile your data given a certain reality. That is something I'm I'm very interested to see in the years to come. People to get really acquainted with their data,
Mm.
really understanding the impacts the data might have in the models they are building, so they can kind of make those informed decisions or will my model perpetuate this behavior because it picked on a certain characteristic of the data. I
Mm.
will know that prior building the model if I know really well my data, for
Mm.
example. And the same happens for the generation of synthetic data. Okay, so that's always something. I would say it's a very interesting, useful step that um, can be further developed or further explored.
It seems like an incredibly hard problem. Like, I feel like this is
Yeah.
going to be
Yeah.
one of the major challenges in machine learning for like the next 10 or 20 years. So, I mean, the entire point of a model in some ways is to have certain types of bias. So, for example,
Yeah.
it is desirable to probably pitch different products to people living in Lisbon, Portugal versus Seattle, Washington versus Paris, France versus London, England. And yet you don't, again, there are these insidious practices like in the United States, they call it redlining, which was the practice of excluding people from neighborhoods based on race. That was just evil. And it still goes
Yes.
on in some ways.
Yes.
And that kind of stuff can be reflected in machine learning models too. And so balancing those considerations of like good bias versus bad bias.
Well, it's directly reflected in like the census data in
Yeah.
the U.S. I mean, there's
Yeah.
like massive gerrymandering going on right now, and
Yeah.
like we see this in Utah, and I
Yeah.
mean, you look at what new census data that's going to accurately reflect that. So it just is what
Yeah.
it is.
It is but it's interesting that I do think it's a very human problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's interesting how sometimes when we are talking about bias and machine learning, we do tend to forget that a lot of that problem comes from us ourselves and the
Mm-hmm.
decisions we made. So it's interesting to see that perspective, if we will be able to to very well define good,
Sure.
bad bias, and so on, and who is going to make that decision as well.
Exactly. It's such a tough problem.
Yeah.
Kind of switching gears. What's next for YData?
Well, definitely, we are truly invested in making our community bigger, bringing more experts from the area to the discussion, exactly to the type of discussions we're having today. All of this is a new space, so definitely that's our focus now, making helping the people navigate space, and of course, um, having our product broadcasted and uh, keep bringing more use cases where synthetic data and data quality at stage of the data preparation for machine learning can benefit of new tooling.
That's awesome. Yeah, like I said, a huge fan of what you're doing. So yeah, keep it up. For people who want to learn more about YData or the data-centric AI community, how would they do that?
Well, definitely LinkedIn, Twitter, but above all, Slack. I'm always available on the Slack of the community. So if you do have any extra questions, or you just want to have a coffee, just ping me there. I'll be happy to.
That's awesome. It's awesome to make yourself accessible to the community like that too. It's I find that that kind of stuff that it really goes a long way towards making people feel like they're part of a community and that there's not
Yeah.
Gatekeepers. I've seen some communities where the leaders of the community are off limits. I find that it's just kind of lame, really. Like you're not Bono or something. So it's like
No.
it's like you can talk to people.
Yeah.
Speaking of community efforts too, I want to give a quick shout out to a cool project somebody's been making me aware of here. So as we all know, there's some pretty terrible stuff happening in the Ukraine right now. So if you want to be a part of this project, Marta, whose email is here, posted in this image here, she's looking for volunteers who can help her develop this app. Basically, it's to help people find supplies, and provide refugee assistance. I think the app is in Poland and Ukraine. That's where it's available. And so if this project interests you, I'd say take a screenshot of this, go to the URL provided here, dopama, I think I'm pronouncing that right, .pl. It's a Polish email, Polish URL, as well as email the Marta here, whose email is posted above. I think there's a lot of cool stuff. She's very enthusiastic about this problem, and we've been talking quite a bit about it. And like I said, if you have any tech skills or want to contribute in any way to this project, please email her. And so, but yeah, so it's definitely
a great initiative.
Yeah, it's a great initiative, and so hopefully everyone can help out in whatever the way they can. The world's gone mad, so let's so
unfortunately,
it's nuts, but cool, yeah, and thanks for being on the show. Again, it's always great to talk to you. And we're also doing a Friday show now. The Monday morning data chat has become so popular. We're now booked all the way into May with guests. So next week we have Ben Stansel. He's a very opinionated data blogger and tweeter. And so we're going to have him on. I'm sure this will be a lot of fun. I either expect great agreement or some pretty fireworks arguments. So this will be a lot of fun. And I think this Friday, actually, we have, let me see here. I know we have, one second here. I should know this stuff. My calendar is super crazy. We have Ryan Wright actually talking about some cool stuff he's doing with basically streaming graphs. So anomaly detection on streams. It was Quine is a project. He something that was developed out of DARPA. So we're going to talk all about that. So anyway, fun times. So, but again, Fabiana, it's always great to see you. So
Likewise, Joe
thanks
and
for being
Matt.
here.
It was a pleasure.
Really great to talk to you. Yeah, look forward to continuing the conversation in the coming months and years. I think there's going to be a lot to say about this space as time goes on. And yeah, look forward to, I imagine someday we'll work with YData. If at some point this will come up with the client, we'll look for opportunities to bring you guys
Yeah.
in.
Hopefully.
So,
Yeah, for sure. So I love it. All right.
Yeah.
And thanks to the audience for
care,
the
guys.
great questions. I'm glad LinkedIn Live actually worked out for a change.
Yeah.
So awesome. All right.
Take
All right.
care.
Take care.